Welcome to the Preserving the Bitcoin Ethos track. As the wave of interest from institutions continues to increase, Bitcoin is facing an interesting trade-off. There are growing concerns that the institutionalization of Bitcoin may come at the expense of preserving Bitcoin's primary value propositions, like the ability to self-custody and freely transfer and store Bitcoin, or the ability to secure the network in a decentralized way that relies on a security model that is not necessarily aligned with the frameworks institutions use to assess the investability of an asset. In this track, we're going to go through these trade-offs, discussing the institutionalization of Bitcoin as it relates to custody, highlighting what the ESG framework is missing about Bitcoin, and addressing the importance of maintaining Bitcoin's open source ethos.
Welcome all. My name is Matt Odel. I'm excited to be here for the first panel of the Preserving the Ethos of Bitcoin track. I'm proud to be joined here by the co-founder of Unchained Capital, Dhruv Bansal, the co-founder and CTO of Casa, Jameson Lopp, and Wiz, who is the co-founder of mempool.space project, heavily part of the BISC project, and runs his own ISP in Tokyo. Welcome, guys. Pretty excited for this conversation. So I think, one of the main things we want to focus on here is why all the different elements that you can do in terms of how you interact with the Bitcoin network and how you store your own Bitcoin. And I think an interesting aspect of Bitcoin culture is this idea of don't trust, verify. And I think the audience would be interested to hear from you, Jameson, about what you think. What does that mean to you when you think don't trust, verify?
Well, it basically means that there's a new type of security model that is available to people who are using Bitcoin that wasn't really possible in other types of financial and accounting systems. And basically what it comes down to is you can do all of the accounting yourself. You don't have to go ask third parties for data to try to audit yourself and hope that they haven't lied about anything or made any mistakes. And so a fundamental aspect of Bitcoin really comes down to basic accounting and the fact that you can check everything that's ever happened on the Bitcoin network yourself without having to trust that someone's being honest with you.
Awesome. I think that's very well put. And that's something that is not really possible without Bitcoin or before Bitcoin. It is way more difficult for that to happen. Dhruv, your company specializes in kind of onboarding people that have maybe never been never used Bitcoin before. When you talk to someone who's never used Bitcoin before and they're thinking about how they want to store their keys, where do you kind of start with, how they should approach that?
I think, to be clear, most customers that we work with actually are already using Bitcoin and they're storing it themselves and they're looking for a better way to store it. So it's an easier conversation. There is a population for sure of customers that are new to Bitcoin. And I think what characterizes our conversation with them is, well, why are you buying the Bitcoin? Is it really to gamble? Is it to speculate? No, the answer, at least at the level that we're working at, is typically, I think that this is an important thing. It's not going away. I'm going to take it really seriously. I'm buying it as a hedge against these other things I see happening in the world. It's a meaningful part and a very deliberate investment that these people are making. And a big part of why they're making is because they recognize that it's got properties that other asset classes don't have, that they get to have certain kinds of controls and transparency and certainty about their ownership and the inability for that ownership to be taken away from them, to be diluted. That's a big part of why they're buying it. And so then the idea of buying this asset that has these properties and then not gaining those properties because of the way that you choose to hold that asset doesn't really ring true with them. And so it's challenging to hold Bitcoin in safe ways at massive scales that institutions and family offices and some of the folks that we work with, are going to be operating at. But there are ways. And companies like ours here on this panel today specialize in those areas, and we're making it easier all the time. We're collaborating with folks in the open source space to make it easier. But I think the saddest outcome would be if Bitcoin were invented with and had all these amazing properties, people didn't understand them or value them enough to care and preserve them, and we somehow lost these properties through delegating our control and our custody to third parties because we didn't want to think in a nuanced way about this very important problem. So I'm really happy to be part of this panel today. It gives me an opportunity to kind of bang the drum and talk about smarter and safer ways to get what large holders are looking for.
So Dhruv, you mentioned trusting third parties. Obviously, Unchained Capital and Casa are third parties. A lot of people, when they approach Bitcoin for the first time, they think about it from their traditional perspectives. They think there's only two options. You have the option of you holding your own Bitcoin yourself and all the responsibilities on yourself, or the third party, a broker or someone, a custodian that you hire to hold it for you. But that's not the case, right? There is this middle ground where you have this concept called collaborative custody. Would you like to dive into that?
Yeah, sure. I think, we do sometimes a disservice when we describe Bitcoin as digital gold. It kind of is, and it kind of gets people on board and thinking about what might be useful or interesting about Bitcoin. But it's more than that, as we all know. There's a programmability to this digital gold that we've created. And I think I'm definitely of the tribe that believes that too much programmability ruins the money, but a certain amount is really useful. And in particular, it allows for constructions that arrange it so it's not just one party or one entity that controls the Bitcoin. We can decide we want to build configurations in which some number of people together out of some larger number, typically we call it M out of N, signers can get together to move Bitcoin around. We can make that idea more complex by adding things like time locks. There's a lot of options here. What we think Unchained has really been pushing, and folks like Casa as well, is that this flexibility isn't just intended for you to consume on your own. That for a while, multi-sig was thought of as something a company like Unchained might do internally to protect their own funds in a better way. Companies like Coinbase are very famous for using multi-sig internally to protect their own funds. Collaborative custody comes from the idea that multi-sig can be used to protect funds across boundaries, such as people or companies, and that this might actually be the best and right way to custody Bitcoin at scale. It has some serious advantages in our view over attempting to either custody everything yourself, in which case you're 100% responsible for every possible security hole, and you have to monitor everything all the time 100% yourself, or just giving up the essential properties of Bitcoin and asking someone else to do all that hard work for you, which is the other failure mode. Recognizing that there's this space in the middle, this very large territory, actually, where you get to define exactly the kind of controls and risk you want and which ones you want to delegate to other key holders in your quorum. It turns out to be, I think, the absolutely correct way for the largest of Bitcoin holders to custody their stacks.
Awesome. So Wiz, I mean, you've often considered the Bitcoiner's Bitcoiner. You've been around for a long time in the Bitcoin space. You see all these institutions coming in and playing around with Bitcoin for the first time. To you, how important is it that they, start to understand Bitcoin best practices?
Yeah, that's a good question. A couple weeks ago, I was in El Salvador, and I was just playing tourist on the Bitcoin beach, and it was really surprising to me to see how the Bitcoin economy was developing there for, the real average individual, just peer-to-peer mom and pop shops. Like, how does a grandma use Bitcoin? And surprisingly, they tend to use these completely centralized 100% custodial Lightning wallets. And at first I was surprised by that, but I thought about this for a while, and I realized that actually it makes a lot of sense for Bitcoin to kind of start out this way. They're getting the inflation resistant properties of Bitcoin this way. They're storing value in Bitcoin, but they're not getting the seizure resistant properties or the censorship resistant properties of Bitcoin by using it that way. And when I started to think about it a bit more, I realized that this is actually the current state of Bitcoin right now. There's probably not going to be maybe like 90% of the people in the world probably can't afford to do on-chain Bitcoin transactions, or even have a Raspberry Pi full node to run their own Bitcoin transactions on. They're probably going to be trusting some kind of intermediary, and whether that be like a collaborative custodial solution or just a total custodial solution. It seems to be, at least right now anyway, until the technology advances where we have more options available, that it seems like this is the direction that it's going. And obviously, as a Bitcoiner, this is really concerning because one of the main points of Bitcoin is that it's supposed to be unconfiscatable and uncensorable. But if you look at how a country like El Salvador is starting to adopt it, they don't have those properties yet. It's a good starting point, but I feel there's a lot of work to be done for the individual community out there, especially in the more developing countries where, they're really they don't have a computer even, or some people don't even have a smartphone. They just have a piece of paper with a QR code on it attached to their shop's window, and that's how they transact with Bitcoin. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
There's some interesting similarities there that you mentioned, that maybe a shop owner in El Salvador, or a large institution like a Morgan Stanley or something might both come in through a custodian that has third-party risk. But as they mature within the ecosystem, hopefully they move into setups that are more censorship resistant. Jameson, to the audience who might not realize the history of Bitcoin custodian and custodial risk, can we highlight for why custodian risk is so important to Bitcoiners? Why have we been hurt so much in the past? What is this risk? Why should these companies worry about fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders in terms of securing their Bitcoin in a more censorship resistant fashion?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to the properties of Bitcoin as a new asset class. Kind of like Dhruv alluded to, this is a new system that allows us to do things that haven't been possible before, but some of the basic valuable attributes of it, these things we talk about, censorship resistance and whatnot, they have trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs is there are no takebacks. If you make a mistake, if you lose the keys, if the funds are stolen from you, if anything goes wrong, there is no authority to cry out to try to revert your mistake. Now, the flip side of that is that there is no authority who can stop you from using the protocol and the network as long as you're following the rules that everyone has agreed to. So, unfortunately, over the 12-year or so history of Bitcoin, there have been a lot of mistakes, and some of them have been catastrophic, of gigantic proportions, hundreds of millions of dollars instantly disappearing, or in many cases, having been lost over a long period of time and not realized until it was too late. And eventually you have a sort of bank run type situation on the custodian in question. So whether the funds are lost due to negligence or hacks or outright scams, it doesn't really matter. What is important is that any large custodian, I would argue anyone who is custodying, but especially any large custodian who is holding onto funds on behalf of many other people in the system, they have to realize that they're a honeypot. They're accruing a lot of value, and therefore the risk against themselves and the funds that they're custodying is much higher, and they have to take a much greater care and due diligence to ensure that they're working inside of a security model that is using Bitcoin to its fullest extent that's possible. And so that's why we especially want institutions to be looking into some sort of distributed key sharing setup. Essentially, what we want is for them to eliminate any single points of failure so that they don't have a catastrophe and we don't have, once again, great waves of despair and people wondering whether or not this system is actually going to work for people in the long run.
Awesome. You made an interesting point there that I feel like it tends we've seen trends throughout Bitcoin's history, and it seems like it constantly repeats where these custodians, these large custodians, tend to centralize more, right? And they tend to have these, I guess it's almost like an economies of scale kind of situation where if more people are using the custodian, they're able to lower their costs. More people want to use them because they know other people are using them. And it provides a greater risk. It creates this greater risk across the whole ecosystem and to all the individual customers of that custodian as a result. I really feel like we touched on collaborative custody earlier, Dhruv, but I feel like it's a very foreign concept to the audience today. And can we go into further like why? Like there's a complete difference between working with Unchained or Casa as a collaborative partner than using one of these centralized custodians. Do you want to like talk about that? Because everything has trade-offs. We have to admit that everything here has trade-offs. But the thing that these institutions I would hope would come away from this is they want to find a good trade-off balance, the best trade-off balance for their company.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want to bring it back even to something that, just pinging off the topic that was just discussed around the inevitable consolidation of custodial services, that there is a certain, economy of scale, as you put it. There's greater marketing that can be put towards it. There's branding. When X company winds up with so much of the big famous companies, Bitcoin, in their quote unquote custodial solution, every smaller company feels like, well, clearly that's the right place to be. I'm usually of the mind that the giant honeypot that everyone else is in is usually not the right place to be, but that's a cultivated response. I think for most people who don't have skin in the game, it's better to say I made the obvious recommendation than it is to make the right recommendation when that comes with job risk for yourself for saying something that is maybe unusual. And you're right, collaborative custody, the way that we practice it at Casa and at Unchained is extremely unintuitive. It's because there are very few asset classes that can be held in such a collaborative structure. We're used to the idea of like, well, I'm maybe going to step beyond my bounds, but I presume that in the world of law, there are ways to build structures in which multiple parties have certain rights over certain things at certain times. And I'm sure it's very different depending on the particular arena or product or asset class that you're talking about. But we're not used to that being programmable. We're not used to that being verifiable by all parties, except for at the great expense of many, many, many lawyers and much time. Collaborative custody makes the claim that Bitcoin, being a digital thing, can be held in programmable escrow, and that those programs can be written, inspected, passed around, verified, validated by all participants. And that means we can build the programs we want to build that provide exactly the structures that we want our Bitcoin to live in. And usually the structure is not either you're 100% responsible or I'm 100% responsible. Those seem to be the structures that Bitcoin kind of inherited as it first came on the scene, right? When in the earliest days of Bitcoin, there was no option but to hold it yourself because no one else would hold it for you. And then emerged easier ways for people to hold it for you, easier ways for you to hold it yourself, kind of ping pongs back and forth until eventually companies like ours come around that say, hey, there's a middle ground, and it's actually some of the most powerful middle ground because it involves some of the more complex contracts that we can build to delineate and expose and talk to everybody about this this kind of custodial risk. I think it ultimately boils down to an attitude, which is that, which is the better security posture? Is it homogeneity or heterogeneity? And in our view, heterogeneity is a extremely powerful barrier against infiltration. That when you have many tens of thousands of people collaborating with each other across the planet in a network that protects itself, that's so much better than a set of keys living in one or two locations that a central company knows about. Maybe there's a Google document that lists them out. Maybe certain people have access to that document. It's much easier to imagine getting through one homogeneous security infrastructure at one company to excise a few different facts than it is to get through many, many different people and companies' security postures to get at all those facts. And so that's just always been our belief at Unchained as a relatively smaller startup, even getting started years ago, that creating scenarios where we are the only obstacle between attackers and our clients' funds is irresponsible. Like we have to always have collaborators who have skin in the game to want to protect those keys just as much as we and our clients do. And so those, I think, are the new kinds of custodians which are coming out. I don't think these could have worked in the early days of Bitcoin. There wasn't the technology available to be able to do the things that we do, but now there is, and we're now going out and pioneering what I think are business models just as much as they are pieces of software.
It's this. It's almost this idea of trying to eliminate central points of failure, whether that's in a malicious external attacker or whether that's an internal issue that you have, or whether that's something that'll make you put a target on your back, because as a company, then you have to step into that position. Wiz, I mean, you've done a lot of work with the BISC network, which is I guess is a decentralized autonomous organization that's operating in a heavily regulated field, along with you're a Liquid Federation member. When you view these types of things in terms of trying to eliminate central points of failure, how important is that for the wider Bitcoin ecosystem?
Yeah, those are a couple good examples of what I feel is a good balance between centralization and complete distribution of all the nodes in the network, like Bitcoin. Liquid and BISC are both kind of like federated security models where you trust the entire federation collectively and whatever governance structure they use internally. And it's all based on a peer-to-peer network and its own set of consensus rules and cryptography, of course. And that allows you to verify what the federation is doing. In the case of like the Liquid Federation, you can verify both the assets, the Bitcoin holdings that the federation controls, and the liabilities of the federation by viewing how many IOUs they've issued, and you can run the numbers and make sure that they match up. This is probably, I think, one of the coolest examples of proof of reserves. It's called, or proof of solvency, because with a traditional centralized company, it's very difficult for them to prove the liabilities, right? It's very easy to say, okay, I have X amount of Bitcoin on this address and I control it, but how do you prove how many liabilities, how many customer holdings you're supposed to have? If that's just an entry in your centralized database, it's not really possible for end users to verify that. They just have to trust some centralized entity. So by making it its own peer-to-peer network with cryptography, Liquid and also BISC in other ways allow the users of that federated network to verify a lot more than would typically be possible with a centralized setup.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times where we run into issues is where it enters almost the traditional world, leaves the Bitcoin world and what's going on over there. So, I mean, proof of reserves is one of the topics that we did really want to hit on here. Is this idea that you want to know if there's a Bitcoin custodian, if there's someone holding a lot of Bitcoin, specifically if they're holding your own Bitcoin, are they actually holding the amount of Bitcoin they say they're supposed to be holding? Is there paper Bitcoin? This is a story that we've heard as old as gold, where is there more gold being printed than is actually in the ground or outside of the ground or whatever? And with Bitcoin, we actually have the ability to do these verifications rather than just trusting entities. Now, you did mention an aspect that proof of reserve is hard to verify the liabilities, but conveniently enough, collaborative custody, that's not the case, right? With collaborative custody, you kind of get, not only do you have the better trust benefit of not having someone else holding complete control of your Bitcoin, but you actually can verify on chain that your specific Bitcoin is there. Jameson, do you want to jump into this a little bit for us?
Yeah, essentially, what you're doing here is you're creating a wallet, and it has various rules that define what the spending conditions of that wallet are. But the resulting set of rules that you are agreeing upon with some other set of participants is then resulting in the Bitcoin addresses that get generated and the funds get deposited into. So because Bitcoin as a protocol is following a bunch of standards. If you are then setting up this collaborative custody solution with other people, you're all agreeing, what cryptographic keys are being used by each one of you, and you can then essentially plug those rules into wallet software that follows the standards, and you can all deterministically, programmatically generate all of these Bitcoin addresses, and then go out and ask your node to tell you, what are the deposits that have happened there? What are the transactions that have happened? And this kind of goes back to that original question of, what's so important about verifying and not trusting in this ecosystem. And when you've set up a wallet where you know what the rules are, you can then independently ask, your own node that's doing the verification, or you can ask many other nodes on the network to also give you, proofs of what has happened in your wallet. Then it becomes a lot easier for an individual or an institution to easily do these audits and verifications. You don't have to go through some complicated process that involves a lot of man hours. It's giving you a great set of efficiency gains from the auditing and verification standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, so it allows you to verify your own balances, but you kind of have to hope that other people are. I mean, I guess your funds are isolated in a collaborative custody environment, right? So if for some reason the partner you're working with is playing funny business with other people, you don't have to worry if that is encumbering basically your Bitcoin, because your Bitcoin is separate and isolated from those other people's Bitcoin. But on a larger scale, there's been a lot of concern and a lot of talk about this idea of rehypothecation of Bitcoin, and this idea that large custodians will take Bitcoin and they'll have way less Bitcoin than they really have, and they'll lend it out to all different people, and as a result, it results in a less efficient market that has suppressed prices. And the potential for catastrophic failure. So I'm curious, Dhruv, how do you view this? Do you view this as like a real risk for Bitcoin? Like, is this something that institutions should care about in terms of the long-term value of their investment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to just connect back to what Jameson and you were just talking about. Like, you're absolutely right, and deserves to be just, I think, underscored that typically, not always, but typically when you're dealing with delegated or third-party custody, all the client's Bitcoin is all in some giant omnibus account. Not always, but typically that's how it matters, because it doesn't really matter where it is, because the client has no control over it. It's the same, it's the custodian that has the control. In collaborative custody systems like Casa and Unchained, every depositor has their own universe that they're part of. It's defined by their own keys and how those keys, bounce off or intersect with their provider's keys. And it's completely isolated from every other participant in that same scheme. And that means proof of reserves. In this context, if you're a depositor into such a system, what does proof of reserves really mean to you? It means proof of your own reserves. You don't give a damn, presumably, that all these other people's funds are really there. Maybe you do, and we'll come back to that point. But moreover, you care about your own funds. And so proving your own funds are here is the first step of any form of proof. And what Jameson is highlighting is that the way that we typically provide that proof in collaborative custody systems is we provide sometimes what we call it at Unchained kind of a treasure map, right? A set of instructions it takes that if you follow, you will find the addresses, which is to say you'll know how to construct them. And since you have your own keys, the treasure you find there, the Bitcoin, right, you'll be able to unlock it. So a way to prove that you have the treasure is to give somebody that has keys a treasure map to go find the treasure, because then you can all collectively get there together. There are more sophisticated ways to prove that you have treasure without giving away a treasure map, typically the kinds that you would want to exchange with financial partners that are not part of the custodial arrangement, that they're a part of some sort of financial arrangement. They don't need to know how to get to the treasure. They merely need to know or be proved that the treasure exists. That's a perhaps different, perhaps more sophisticated kind of proof. In all these systems, we run into challenges that merely defining the treasure map, how the keys interact with the treasure, how to prove the existence. None of these are standardized interactions quite yet. And one of the things I really like about collaborative custody as an engine towards financial instruments more properly is that if you're collaborating to do the custody, you're already having to exchange the treasure map. You're already having to check each other have recently checked in on their keys. That's another feature that both the Casa platform and Unchained both implement, is people are checking in that they really still have their keys, so that the people they're collaborating with have confidence in that process. These are all things you start doing when you're collaboratively custodying. And so if you're doing that, you're sort of getting proof for free. And as you do more sophisticated things, that nature of that proof can become more complex as the nature of what you're collaborating over becomes more complex. An example would be Unchained's loan products, which aren't just depository vaults. They're a more sophisticated financial product. There's collateral involved. And in our case, the borrower is getting the same kinds of or similar kinds of guarantees around ownership and lack of rehypothecation that a depositor would be getting, even though the financial instrument is much more complex. And our hope at Unchained is that over time, many, many more financial instruments can be brought into the fold of this kind of arrangement, where we are spelling out explicitly the custodial, the rules that we want to collectively live by that matches the rules of some financial instrument. And because we are participants in the custodial rules, we don't have to trust anybody about this. We know that the thing back in the financial instrument is going to be bona fide because we can just inspect the treasure map, so to speak. This is a very powerful way to collaborate to build not just custody, but financial services.
Dhruv, I mean, since you brought it up, I just want to touch on it before we run out of time here. I mean, I think a lot of the institutional players are considering, collateralized loans on their Bitcoin or interest-bearing products on their Bitcoin to put their money to work, so to speak, which we often hear in the space and obviously in the wider financial ecosystem. A service that offers collaborative custody version of those does not rehypothecate by design. You have proof of non-rehypothecation, but as a result, you get worse rates. What would you say to a potential customer that says, I would rather go for a service that does not give me those security guarantees, but gives me a way better rate?
I think it's everybody's decision to decide where they want to balance security, short-term risk, short-term reward with the long-term, risk and reward. There's no right answer. I won't pretend that there is one for everybody in all places. I tend to be very conservative, and I tend to say that I already own an asset in Bitcoin that grows at 100% plus per year. Am I willing to take a risk that is not insignificant, then that it might be rehypothecated and lost to me forever in practical terms, if not in legal terms? Maybe I will get 1/100th of it back after a 10-year legal ordeal. But if I want to keep the Bitcoin, I might elect not to enter into those kinds of things. Conversely, if maybe I'm the kind of person who is earlier in their experience, like Wiz referred to, which I think is very smart, but I think of Bitcoin as chiefly protecting me from inflationary risk, and I don't understand or care about these other kinds of risks, well, then I don't understand or care about them. So this is a great deal for me. I don't want to make people feel stupid because they embrace what to them feels like a really great deal, because they haven't yet understood or appreciated these other properties that you can also get with the same asset class. I think, honestly, some people are going to do both. So instead of trying to prescribe what is the absolute correct way to be, I think it's on providers to offer options. It's quite clear that delegated custody and what I would perceive as high risk in order to get a modest return on Bitcoin is very exciting to many investors because it's what they're used to from, I think, the world of fiat. It's also true that there's huge percentages of people for whom that seems very scary, and they're much more interested in just preserving their coins as long as possible and treating that as a form of earnings almost. So I know where we tend to focus is on the security and the collaborative custody side. We don't tend to want to create risk and hot wallets and anything like that. But that doesn't mean we're not interested in lending out Bitcoin or rehypothecating it. It just means that we want to do it under terms that are extremely transparent, that are likely written into Bitcoin smart contracts, and that are opt-in for any customers that want to get into those things. It's just a different way of trying to package up certain kinds of risk. I think you're ultimately right, though, Matt. The riskiest way to lend out your Bitcoin is to have no guarantees, and it'll always give you the highest return. Let's hope.
Yeah, really great insight and framing, Dhruv. Thank you for that. So, we're nearing the end here. I figure we'll go around with some final thoughts. We'll start with Wiz, then Jameson, then back to Dhruv. Wiz, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think for the institutions out there that are considering how to build their stack, like if they want to be a Bitcoin bank and offer these kinds of banking services on Bitcoin, it's really important to architect your stack from the ground up in a way where users can transparently, cryptographically verify both the assets and liabilities. And there are existing free open source software projects out there that you can build upon to achieve this goal, where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And many companies like Casa and Unchained are using very nice multi-sig solutions where the customers have some joint custody or collaborative custody, and that's definitely the way to go. If you're going to do the full Mount Gox style, all the money's in this bucket, and we don't know what happened to the bucket, it's gone. Yeah, that's the end of your reputation and the end of your business. So it's better to do it the right way.
Coming out with the hard truths. Jameson?
Well, I would say Bitcoin is both very freeing in some of the things it allows you to do, but it's also very limiting in the sense that you can't do anything that you want, and you're not going to be able to change Bitcoin necessarily to do what you want. You are going to be constrained by the rules of the system, and you really need to think of it just as another internet protocol, where if you break that protocol, then anything you build on top of it simply is not going to work. So, we had some issues in the early days where, there were questions around governance and whatnot. And I think it's been pretty well ironed out by now that Bitcoin as a protocol is fairly solidly set where it is. It will, of course, continue to evolve, but it's going to be very conservative, and the highest priority is for us to keep this thing running as solidly as possible.
Very good point. If you think you can just come into Bitcoin and change it, you're going to have a bad time. Dhruv, final thoughts?
I guess I would just say, when it comes to adoption, I think it's tempting, especially at large companies where a lot of people don't have skin in the game, to think of Bitcoin as a feather in one's cap, that one can adopt Bitcoin and it'll just be like a good thing. That I was the person that got Bitcoin here. And it always reminds me of a story I once heard about, someone getting a website made at Coca-Cola back in the day in the late 90s. And like, what did the website accomplish? Nothing, except that it meant that Coca-Cola had a website. It wasn't perhaps until decades later that Coca-Cola understood that the internet for them wasn't just having a website. It was understanding and connecting with their customers, loyalty programs, collecting data, like optimizing the way that they ship and run their business. I think it'll take companies a little while to understand that Bitcoin isn't just, wait, hey, what's our Bitcoin story? Do we have some Bitcoin? Do we accept Bitcoin? It turns into, like, how does Bitcoin affect our business model? How does it change the value proposition of our entire industry? And I think the businesses that are able to start custodying Bitcoin the right way and start seeing keys and collaborative custody and smart contracts earlier than other companies that they compete with are going to compound their advantage. And I think they're going to be the companies that, in retrospect, as we often say of companies today, those are the ones that really understood the internet early and they were able to adapt to it, right? The other ones kind of got thrown around by the wayside. So I would say, if you can get savvy to the way that Bitcoin really wants you to think about it, you'll do very well in the long term. So that's just another reason to think about it natively.
Really great. I just want to thank our panelists, Dhruv, Jameson, Wiz. I want to thank ARK Invest and the other organizers of the B Word for hosting this very important conversation. And I want to wish our audience the best of luck entering this brave new world of Bitcoin. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second talk in the Preserving the Bitcoin Ethos track. Today we have Brett Winton, Director of Research at ARK Invest, and we have Alex Gladstein, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. And today we're going to jump right into it. Bitcoin, ESG, what does ESG mean? Is Bitcoin ESG? And I think the main place to start here is, what is the social value of Bitcoin? Why is this worth the energy we're putting into it? Why is it worth preserving? Why is it so important to humans on planet Earth?
Yeah. Look, the fact is that not everybody has the same financial system that we have. To be very simple and plain about it. 4.3 billion people in today's world, as we speak, live under an authoritarian regime. That's about 53% of the world population in about 95 countries. And 1.3 billion people living in about 35 countries live under double or triple digit inflation. So for them, their money system doesn't work the same way ours does. They don't have real property rights that are protected by like a constitution or like an independent court system. They don't necessarily have a currency that's fairly stable. They don't necessarily have protections against confiscation or demonetization. They might be completely cut off from the fintech that we enjoy, things like PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay. They may not have that at all, or they may have a totally separate kind of fintech that's a surveillance and control mechanism, like the 1 billion plus people in China face every day. So, we need to think about the fact that only a small portion of humanity lives in a situation where they benefit from both a reserve currency, meaning a currency that other central banks save in, right? Which would be basically the euro, the EU, the Americans, the dollar, Canadians with their currency, the Australians, the Swiss, the Japanese, the British. That's about it. Who have both a reserve currency and a liberal democracy. 13% of the world. The other 87%, that's what we're here for today. So for the other 87%, Bitcoin is very important. And if you don't grasp that, if you don't have that context, then this whole debate about the energy use is pointless, of course, because if you don't think Bitcoin has social value, then of course all of the energy is a waste. What I want to try to discuss here today is that Bitcoin is so incredibly important from a global social value perspective. It can deliver so many benefits for people who deal with broken currencies, broken monetary systems, and a lack of financial infrastructure worldwide.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think there's, from the investor and the ESG or impact investing perspective, there's a tendency for those frameworks to be interpreted through the lens of the people who are developing them, who happen to be, like I have the privilege of having pretty secure property rights and a reasonably stable currency, but the majority of the world doesn't. And so it's almost philosophically, when you're designing, when you are investing in something that's going to be socially valuable, I think you need to be investing in something that's going to be socially valuable on a forward-looking basis, rather than, we have this particular backward-looking mechanism by which we can deliver its social value. And it should be socially valuable to as many people as possible. And so, the state has a monopoly on violence. Should they also have a monopoly on money? I think is actually an interesting and provocative question. As in that the potential value of a digital bearer instrument that has a stable and predictable monetary policy is it also puts competitive pressure on monetary systems to liberalize their financial system to compete with it. And so providing kind of this bearer instrument, and Alex, I'm sure you have a lot of anecdotes from specific countries, but to people in those systems offers them both profound utility to the individual, the ability to opt out of the state monopoly on money, and it puts pressure on the state itself to treat its citizens more fairly, to be more kind of rules-based in how it treats rule of property and rule of law. So,
So Alex, can we dive into just a couple of those anecdotes? Just because I think it's good we've set the stage, right? You need to accept that there is social value, otherwise the conversation kind of unfolds there. And we have these, I think, pretty eye-opening statistics. Half the world is under authoritarian rule. 1.2 billion people living under triple-digit inflation. But those I think are somewhat harder for individuals to grasp. So what are some concrete anecdotes of how is Bitcoin solving these problems?
Yeah, and just before I go into that, you just have to realize that I know a lot of people listening are like, well, money is created by the state. That's what it is. Okay. Well, remember that 53% of the population lives under an authoritarian state. So, they're not really benefiting from that arrangement where money is the purview of Caesar. That's not like helping them. They face, again, shuttered bank accounts, frozen payments, discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have a money that whether or not you like its attributes, it is indisputably money. It's been adopted by a nation state in El Salvador as legal tender, and it has these different kind of architectural features than fiat currency. And the most important part from a human rights perspective is that it's open and neutral. and borderless. So nobody can like stop you from using it or discriminate against you. Anyone, regardless of their faith or creed or belief or color of their skin or gender or, you know, nationality or what kind of passport they hold or what kind of level of wealth they can hold, any of them can receive Bitcoin instantly from me right now, as long as they have access to the internet. And this is just like continually underestimated. You know, this is what needs to sort of, we need to peel this back and start to explore this. And the first angle that I'd like you to think about is remittances. And then I'm going to go into just a couple examples of what I've seen out in the human rights world. But just in terms of remittances, you have to consider that when I send a $200 remittance from America to sub-Saharan Africa today, the average fee is 8%, and it's 9% on a $500 remittance. So that's a huge amount of waste. So this is like a huge amount of percentage of GDP for some of these countries. I'm just going to list some of these countries, and I'll list the percentage of their GDP that is based on remittances. So for El Salvador, as a lot of you know, it's 24%. For Nepal, it's 23%. For Haiti, which has just been in the news, 23%, right? Lebanon, 19%. And then some huge countries. We have the Philippines, almost 100 million people, 10%. Egypt, biggest country in the Arab world, 8%. Bangladesh, 100 plus million people, 7%. Vietnam, 6%. Nigeria, 200 million people, 4%. So we're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars every year, you know, cumulatively across the world, like about $700 billion in remittances. And you're talking fees on average of 5, 10, you know, even higher percent. So when we look at Bitcoin-based apps, like for example, the Send Cash app, which was designed in Nigeria, you can send $200, $500. You can send that to Nigeria right now using their app via Bitcoin, and it deposits as Naira in someone's Nigerian bank account in minutes with no fee. So we can start seeing that like the current system is dinosaur technology, and we're going to move towards a more innovative system, and that's going to be huge for remittances. Where something's good for remittances, it's also good for donations and for human rights movements, right? So in my experience, what I've seen just in the last year, I'll give 3 examples. In Belarus, the people have been protesting peacefully against Alexander Lukashenko's regime, which has been in power since essentially the end of the Soviet Union. And he has been very brutal, and there's not a whole lot of options for people who oppose him. So what they're basically doing is striking. Then they're staying home from their like state sort of public sector jobs, right? And that is something that they can only do if they can get some sort of other money. So we work with this organization. My organization has been working with this group called Bansal, which is a kind of like Belarusian grassroots movement across Europe and across the world. And they've been like taking applications through Telegram, basically from these striking workers who are applying and describing their situation. And if they check out by this group, they get a 1,500 euro payment in Bitcoin directly onto their phone to sustain their movement and to keep food on their table for their family while they put pressure on the regime, right? So more than 180 Bitcoin have been sent into Belarus this way since last August. We're talking many, many, many millions of dollars. And there's no other way the money could get in. The regime controls the banking system. So, you know, this is a remarkable innovation for human rights. I mean, they get the money right on their phone. They have the ability to, whether they want to save it or if they want to spend it, they can either buy gift cards with it using services like Bitrefill, or they can use apps that allow them to like basically trade the Bitcoin to a very, you know, happy Russian or Ukrainian currency dealer who's delighted to take the Bitcoin off their hands and deposit into their bank account as basically a direct transfer, rubles into their account where they can go buy groceries. So this movement has been like sustained by Bitcoin. It's very interesting. Second example is in Nigeria. Last fall, there was huge national protests that broke out against police violence and basically what is known as like, you know, anti-SARS movement, you know, against the sort of special police in Nigeria that would go around and steal people's stuff and beat them up. And it's sort of like grew beyond that to just general displeasure with how corrupt and violent the government was. So one organization called the Feminist Coalition started to take a leading role in opposing the government, organizing protests. Now, they started to raise money using fintech, traditional means, but those things got shut down. like Flutterwave bank accounts. So the government actually shut those accounts down. So they turned to Bitcoin, and they actually used BTC Pay Server, and they started accepting Bitcoin from all around the world. And Jack Dorsey shared this, and a lot of other celebrities shared it. And they ended up raising, I think, about 7 or 8 Bitcoin at the time, which was huge for them. Huge for them, $100,000+, which went to sustaining those protests. And then a third example would be in Russia. Now Alexei Navalny he's in prison as the opposition leader of that country. But when he was campaigning for the last few years, his campaign, accepted a lot of donations in Bitcoin. And Putin can do a lot of things, but he can't stop a Bitcoin account. So I think those are things that I've seen in my work as a human rights activist, where I'm starting to realize, wow, not only is Bitcoin this powerful tool for like anyone really, just to connect to their family around the world and share value in a parallel system, but it's also this, extremely important mechanism for pushing back against authoritarian power.
Those are great points, Alex. And then I think, Brett, you were about to cut in discussing property rights and how Bitcoin ties into those.
Yeah, I think the broad message is from a sustainable development goals perspective, where at ARC we focus on and dimension kind of the prospective technological impact on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. One of the major sustainable development goals, in fact, one that's tied into a lot of them, is financial inclusion. And it's clear, like, financial inclusion can't exist if somebody gets to decide, oh, this particular ethnic group is excluded, or this particular politically unfavored class is excluded. And so it's, I think, undeniable that a technology that gives people property rights, not by the permission of some political and authoritarian regime, but independent of that regime, is a powerful mechanism by which both those goals could and should be met. And that it's, a profoundly democratizing invention. Rule of law shouldn't just be for the rich. And right now, for much of the world, that's the way it plays out. This puts pressure on the world and on authoritarian regimes to kind of liberalize and bestow property rights on the citizens that are kind of operating in their political geographies.
So, Brett, you brought up some great points on how Bitcoin aligns with the SDG goals. But I guess another question is, how well do those goals align with humanitarian efforts broadly? And, what is the right way to think about ESG framing from an investor standpoint as well? So I guess, Alex, we'll jump to you first, because I think you've got an interesting take on how human rights and the SDG goals might not line up perfectly.
Sure. So the SDG goals, which power, of course, a huge amount of impact investing and are the North Star for a lot of the ESG frameworks, were created by authoritarian governments, basically, written up by, no less than Assad's Syria, actually, if you look into it. And if you look carefully and parse the goals themselves, they don't mention concepts like democracy or elections or privacy or civil liberties, separation of powers. These words are just missing completely from the 10,000 word manifesto that describes the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Even the word human rights is barely mentioned. But again, like, you're talking about a vision for the world in the future where a bunch of governments got together and said, here's where we want to be. Here's our goal. Here's where we want to be by 2030 or 2040 or whatever. And we don't want to have democracy or privacy or freedom or civil liberties or separation of powers, or we don't want to fight corruption. None of those words are in there. So from that perspective, I think Bitcoin actually really is like a helpful kind of complement because it does provide people real freedoms. Like, it actually provides people actual economic agency and sovereignty. And that's been a problem with the international development world as a whole for the past few decades in general. Like, it actually creates dependency in many cases, in many parts of the world. And you become like a bondage to loans, basically, from abroad. And you don't create the economic activity required to achieve true independence. But with Bitcoin, individuals can actually start to be free from that. and to use a currency that's not, tied to some foreign power or occupier or whatever. So I think in many ways, Bitcoin is like a helpful complement to the sort of SDG, ESG framework in that it can kind of cut through a lot of the noise and deliver actual freedom to people.
So then kind of to I guess to repeat what you were saying in a different way is it's almost more SDG than the countries who wrote it would like, because it's offering even more freedom and democracy than those written statements might lead to by themselves.
Yeah, it's the real deal, and that's why I think a lot of governments are going to be apprehensive about it. But the engine that it presents to drive economic growth and activity and sovereignty is unprecedented.
And so, Brett, how do you think about it from an investor's standpoint and the way that ESG and these SDG goals are being used by investors?
Yeah, I think that for one thing, Alex is right. Like the document, the Sustainable Development Goals were, coordinated across a number of governments, some of whom have clear human rights issues, and so would probably fight heavily against that language being included in them. And they provide like a reasonable framework for like, these are some things we should go after. And so, and I believe that like Bitcoin, in addition to complementing the Sustainable Development Goals, actually advances the ball forward along a number of them in profound ways. And one of the issues I have with basically ESG investing and Sustainable Development Goal or impact investing, or I think the way in which it's misused, is people again often are doing it as like a kind of like a de-risking, backward-looking exercise of, oh, I'm not going to invest in tobacco companies because tobacco is bad, rather than thinking carefully about, as you are deploying capital, are you deploying capital against the opportunities and really the innovations that are going to profoundly inflect kind of the productivity delivery to the world, including to, the 50% of people who live in authoritarian regimes, or 53%. And so that's kind of, I think people come up with very different conclusions about how useful something is from an impact investing perspective if they're looking at, oh, this is what it has done versus this is what it is likely to do. Because some of the examples you brought up, Alex, they're small, right? And you can easily tell that kind of self-sovereignty, that kind of property rights conferred to everybody who gets onto the network on Earth will have a profound impact on the way that economic systems operate and the kind of how kind of universally accessible they are to people around the world.
Yeah, but just on that note, you got to consider that when you allocate capital into the Bitcoin space, you're powering this machine that isn't that small. I mean, we're talking probably anywhere from 170 to 200 million users, and we're talking millions of users in Nigeria, Argentina, Turkey, Philippines, India. I mean, these are some of the places that have the highest per capita Bitcoin use in the whole world. So we're already in the tens of, you're impacting tens of millions of people, right? And you're allowing them to pull themselves up, and you're giving them, you're strengthening and you're growing the network effect of a new system that is, again, complementary, I guess you could say at best, but really, really parallel to the legacy banking system, which is highly discriminatory, exclusionary. I mean, it's not like the people in these countries have, can invest in the S&P. That they have no way to connect. We're talking about the majority of the people in the world today. They have no real good mechanism for saving. All of a sudden, arguably the world's best performing savings instrument of the last 12 years is available to them with no need to sign a form or get permission or go to the bank or do any of that stuff that they can't even really do anyway because a lot of them are unbanked. No, they just need internet access. So it's a tremendous kind of equalizing force that really levels the playing field. And that's why I think it's such an important thing to include if you're serious about the S in the ESG.
Yeah,
and
but I'm saying 200 million people on 7 billion is still really small.
2%, 2 to 3%.
Yeah. So it's like, this is so people can look at this for one thing. So let's get into energy in a second, but people look at this and then they extrapolate, it's going to boil the oceans and use all the world's energy. But if that would be, it's not going to boil the oceans. Two, like it should use more energy because it should be adopted at wider scale. And that's the way in which you secure kind of all of the positive externalities that the network creates with kind of the proof of work use of energy to keep the network, robust against kind of like an authoritarian regime saying, okay, and now, this ethnic group is not allowed to use this network.
Yeah, and there's two levels to this, right, in terms of empowerment. There's individual empowerment inside countries for communities and individuals, families, companies, etc. And that is being delivered by the Bitcoin network. But there's also the energy component. And I want to piggyback on what you just said, because if you think about these developing nations, oftentimes like how do they kind of finance their activities? They can print more currency, which often leads to devaluation. They can sell off some of their reserves, which oftentimes is not ideal, or they can seek external financing from like the World Bank or the IMF, which is what a lot of them end up doing, and they end up getting into like a very big hole. Well, get this: in El Salvador, they're basically starting this process of selling bonds off of like the future untapped renewable energy that their country has under their feet. In this case, geothermal. And you're talking about this idea of volcano bonds, right? But if you think about it and you extrapolate across the developing world, all of these countries have tremendous untapped, stranded renewable energy sources, whether they be geothermal, hydro, solar, wind. And instead of going to the World Bank with a cup and say, please give me some, and have to deal with like austerity and structural reforms if you can't pay it back in time. No, you can just sell to the world market, bonds based on your renewable energy holdings, because those are now being able to be monetized through Bitcoin, whereas they weren't before. That's a revolution. I think that's really important.
And so, Brett, before we go down the energy rabbit hole, can you frame it for us in 30 seconds? What's the big complaint out there about Bitcoin's energy use? And then what would be the way that you think investors and other people should think about Bitcoin's use of energy?
Yeah, so the Bitcoin, I'm sure everybody in this conference is familiar with proof of work and how the Bitcoin network is secured, but generally the idea is that as the value of Bitcoin increases, because it gets adopted by more people in these countries, assuming it increases, you will naturally have more energy devoted to securing the network. And there will be a degree to which that diminishes as halvings occur and as more of it shifts to transaction fees, but you're always going to pay some energy cost to keep this network secure and decentralized. And so for one thing, as Alex said at the start, if you don't believe in the fundamental utility of the network, you're not going to believe that the energy cost is a good use of energy. But the work that we've done is to show how, because of the unique characteristics of Bitcoin as an energy tool, Bitcoin mining as an energy tool, it is particularly well suited to helping underwrite, basically providing financial incentive to develop renewable energy resources. So the work we did was to show that if you were to try to power an entire microgrid with solar, once you started to power more than 40% of that grid with solar, you began to have to take on a higher and higher cost energy from your solar system because it wasn't being used. Like you had to way overpower it to provide more percentage grid energy, and so you created all this excess energy that you couldn't do anything with, or you'd have to build way too big a battery system. If you have a mechanism, as El Salvador now does, where you can take that excess energy and convert it into an economically useful thing without having to create transmission distribution to it, without having to kind of connect to some kind of external party, without having to go through a permissioning structure on how we do this, then it allows you to increase the size. You can overbuild your solar and battery system to provide basically all of your grid energy with a renewable resource, because of the spillover energy gets converted into economically valuable product. And so in the El Salvador example, what I think is exciting about it is they're kind of going to go about it the opposite way, where they say, we develop the renewable energy resource to drive the Bitcoin miners, and then they're going to have spillover energy and infrastructure that allows the rest of the economy to electrify more aggressively than it otherwise would. And so it's kind of like, if you're at an equilibrium where in emerging markets you have really inconsistent electric power because you can't get the capital to invest in good electric equipment. And even if you do, you're often doing like diesel or natural gas, where it's like you have to pay huge sums to outside parties to kind of import it, and then you're subject to that volatility. If instead you can underwrite kind of Bitcoin mining against your renewable energy source, like solar in Africa, then you actually can create the electrical power infrastructure that your country needs to get to a different economic level.
Yeah, and let me just give a quick example there. In the Congo, in the DRC, only about 9% of people in this country of 90 million have access to the grid, right? So most people cook their meals using charcoal rather, that they just basically used from cutting down trees, deforesting the environment around them and burning it, right? Creates indoor air pollution, kills all kinds of amazing animals, creates a really negative quality of life. So outside investors have always wanted to allow or enable these populations to tap the hydro resources of the Congo River. So 4 or 5 years ago, a couple investors, including Warren Buffett and the EU, helped build dams, hydro dams, on the tributaries of the Congo near Virunga National Park to aid in this process, to help electrify the country, basically. And the problem is that it's very expensive to connect the populations to the power source, so it takes a lot of time. So what ends up happening often is these projects end up basically falling into disrepair because they don't actually complete the process of connecting the grid or the people to the actual plant. This was at risk of happening, actually, but about a year and a half ago, these the rangers at Virunga National Park decided to do Bitcoin mining on the hydro plants, and this gives them an immediate source of revenue, and that they can actually reinvest to pay for the connection of the lines. So I think what you're going to see happening moving forward is not only the ability for nations to actually raise money through bonds based on renewable energy with the promise of Bitcoin mining, but actually the investment and building the renewable energy farms in a way where they can be profitable, at least generate revenue right away to help them actually build out, electrify, create jobs, and create economic activity. I think this is very underrated and needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and at a very high level, we think that, in our modeling suggests, a world with Bitcoin mining as an energy tool is a world that results in a larger amount of renewable energy being developed for end use than a world without. So the big concern is basically big bucket and sustainable development goals is climate action. We think this is beneficial to climate action, not detrimental. It is a net positive. So accepting the social utility, you should also expect that there is climate action utility within.
Yeah. Another example, South Africa's grid, huge country, 90% reliant on fossil fuels. Well, guess what? Bitcoin's going to change that. So Bitcoin is going to incentivize the construction and the development to allow individuals, businesses, and the government there to take advantage of these massive solar and wind resources they have in that country. And that grid's going to change because of Bitcoin. So it's something you really need to look deeper into. And I totally agree with you that even beyond the S, once you understand the S, once you understand that this thing is such a powerful social tool, it is also something that's going to be totally transformative on the E side as well.
Yeah.
So then as we wrap this up, what is the incremental question, the incremental work that institutions should be doing to look at this, right? We've got property rights. We have the S you were mentioning. Probably the first half of this discussion was on the S. Closer to the last half was on the E as energy. And, what's, as an institution, what can you do to make this, fit into that ESG bucket? If it is this checkbox routine, Brett, what's the step?
For me, I'm kind of flummoxed because it's very obvious to me, given the modeling that we've done, just on the environmental side, that this is a net positive externality that kicks off the network. And you get it because it has such profound, impactful, social benefits. So I kind of welcome people to engage with our research, to really think carefully about on what they are trying to do and the degree to which they are subject to near-term political pressure that could be being imposed by actors that actually don't have the best interest of the world in in their like state of goals. I don't know. Alex, what do you think? Help us.
Yeah, look, as a concluding thought, as you think about allocating capital and getting involved in Bitcoin, and you're reading this stuff in the news and you're worried about it, just do more research and reading. And when you keep learning about it, you will realize that in a sense, Bitcoin is really like a world institution. It's the world's largest open source money project. Anybody can access it. No government controls it. When we gathered to set the monetary policy of the world at Bretton Woods at the end of World War II, we wish we had something like Bitcoin. It's something that you would kind of dream up to be that kind of global money for the world, because it's not manipulatable by any sort of corporation or government. It is really, truly money for the people. And it is both, again, going to help liberate. It already has liberated and provided an escape for so many millions of people today. It has done such incredible work on that front. But again, it's also going to completely unlock so much renewable energy around the world, and it's going to transform, honestly, the whole way that we interact with energy, in my belief. So it's something that I think you should proudly be involved with. Absolutely. You're just going to have to dig a little deeper to feel comfortable with yourself, so that you can push all of this FUD like that, all these scary articles aside. Those are special interests, who don't want you to explore Bitcoin, because they're capturing value as middlemen, right? Whether it's the banking sector or whatever. Like, there are reasons they don't want you to get involved in Bitcoin, but deep down, it's a truly remarkable force for freedom around the world. So I would encourage you to learn more. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, Alex, Brett, thank you for joining us today. At ARC, we always say that truth wins out, and we're all active on social media. So feel free to engage with us, and we're in the pursuit of truth. So, we're happy to continue the progress forward on research.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jerry Brito. I'm Executive Director of Coin Center, and with me today I've got Kirupa Pushparaj, who is Head of Intellectual Property and Legal Operations at Square, and he's also a board member of the Crypto Open Patents Alliance, COPA, of which I'm also a board member. Hello, Kirupa.
Hi there, Jerry. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. So today on the agenda, we're going to talk about intellectual property and Bitcoin. And Bitcoin and crypto has many intellectual property challenges, especially in the form of patent trolls. So maybe to start, you could begin by describing the problem and how big it is.
Sure. Let's start with where you queued off, patent trolls. So patents are instruments, legal instruments, which protect innovation. And typically, if you come up with innovative ideas, you protect it with patents. But the problem of patent trolls is a notion that's existed for about 10 to 15 years now, especially worse off in the software fields, where companies that are not operating companies, not really making a product or offering a service, just go and buy random patents and or generate random patents and try to go after actual operating companies that have a service, that have a product, and try to shake them down for a license. And this is, to me, a tax on innovation, a tax on a company successfully operating with a distraction to its operations. Just to illustrate how bad this is, for each patent litigation or a patent asserted against a company, it costs about $1 million to even $5 million just in legal fees to prosecute, to litigate, and to prevail against the patent. So patent trolls use that as kind of the carrot against you and say, oh, you're going to spend $2-3 million on legal fees? Just give us $500,000 in licensing fees and we'll move on. And they've been successful in doing this. In companies like Square, where I work at, we've taken a strong stance against patent trolls. Yes, we respect intellectual property rights of third parties, but not when they are shakedown demands based on invalid patents, patents that they weren't entitled to in the first place. And so we go all the full measure to invalidate those patents for ourselves and for the benefit of the community. So
Right.
patent trolls in Bitcoin is especially antithetical to the whole ethos of Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin was born out of open source. It was built by open source developers. And the foundational building blocks of whatever exists as the architecture and the technology, all the way from Satoshi's paper on what Bitcoin should be and how the technology should work, is open to the community. That's where we're building applications, currencies, groundbreaking technology that's already making a tremendous impact. So for this foundational technology to be locked up in patents by a select few by itself is wrong for the Bitcoin community. The foundational technology is what allows newer technology, newer applications to be built. And for this to be locked up by a select few, and by these select few trying to litigate against all the innovators in the Bitcoin community, will stifle innovation, will stifle growth. And that's the reason we're even discussing how these two come together and what the Crypto Open Patent Association is doing, which we'll talk about in more detail.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's so pernicious because these patent trolls are basically, as you say, they're a firm, but a firm that has no customers, no products. Usually it's composed of mostly lawyers. And all they do is they go out and they buy patents, typically from other firms that were innovative, but maybe now are defunct. They create a portfolio of patents, and then they just begin to sue. And who they begin to sue are small startups in the space who are just trying to build something. And along comes a troll with a patent that is so broad that it's probably defective. It's it would be thrown out, but you'd have to go through a litigation process. And these small startups, or even small startups, don't have the money to do it. Large ones, it might be easier for them just to pay off the troll. So incredibly pernicious. How
quickly there's two breeds of such patent trolls. One who go about buying patents from defunct companies or otherwise. And then the other type of patent trolls who look at how the technology is developing based on actual companies building everything and trying to go file patents into what they're doing and building up a treasure trove separately. So both of them, to me, is a problem. Exactly.
Yeah, and we've seen, especially in the Bitcoin space, different people who have gone out and begun to, file patents for things that are basically open source innovations that already, that basically already exist in the public domain. So how big is this problem, right? Can you give us a sense of the scale?
So let's talk about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general. We already have hundreds of patents either filed or granted. And most of these patents are held by a select few. So there are operating companies that do hold patents in the Bitcoin space, foundational technology related to Bitcoin. But most of the operating companies that we see are the sensible ones who use patents as a defensive mechanism to use against patent trolls if they get sued or otherwise. There are operators right now who've amassed, according to their own publications, that they've amassed hundreds of patents, who have already indicated that they are going to use these patents against developers, against open source developers, and against other companies that are developing innovative solutions, innovative applications in Bitcoin. These companies, a certain few of them, do not have any products, do not have any services, and all they're doing is just file patents. So hundreds of patents in a technology that's relatively still new and is still finding adoption in mainstream usage is a problem. This is how the 5G cellular wars of the previous decade started. And it could have really stifled innovation in what we have as 5G technology right now. But companies came together on a truce over there. But for a technology such as Bitcoin, which is still at its early stage, to have hundreds of patents held by folks who promise to use it against companies is a threat, is a concern that could stifle and hinder innovation and progress in Bitcoin. So we are concerned.
Right. And so, the one answer is that there is strength in numbers. There's a lot more of us who are building things who might be on the receiving end. So this is part of the idea for the Crypto Open Patents Alliance, for COPA. So tell us about COPA, why it exists, what it's supposed to do, and how it works.
Absolutely. So while it was us at Square who started thinking about the idea, COPA, the Crypto Open Patent Association, is an independent organization, a nonprofit that is run by a board of directors, which we'll talk about in a second. And the whole goal of COPA is to form an alliance and attack and tackle the problem of patents being locked up, especially patents that pave the foundational blocks for Bitcoin applications and technology development. So what we do as the organization is it's membership based. Anyone joining as a member, any company joining as a member, and we have a number of major crypto players, Bitcoin players in it already, including Coinbase, Kraken, Square, OKCoin, and a number of others. So companies joining COPA take on a pledge that to the extent they have any patents that cover crypto technology, not just Bitcoin, widely crypto technology, they pledge and actually give out a license that they will never sue any other company or individual on those patents unless it is for a defensive reason. So we've effectively taken all these companies as patents and removed them from the threat of litigation. So that's one aspect, which is great. Large companies have patents. They've made a very sensible choice of not using those patents in an offensive manner that threatens innovation. But then there are so many startups, small companies, which may or may not have patents. And I mentioned this notion about defensive usage of patents, right? If you have patents, other companies don't sue you because there's a threat that you will sue them back or use your patents defensively. What about the small companies that don't have patents? So from that perspective, to protect the entire community, not just the large companies, the large crypto players, we came up with this second part of COPA, which is essentially a shared patent library. Patents that are part of this pledge by these companies that have the patents which have entered into the pledge, essentially pool all their patents into a patent library that could potentially be used by any member in defense if they get affected, if they get sued offensively on a patent. So you should think of this as kind of this protective umbrella that not only protects the individual companies, but the entire community of membership at large. So if company A has 10 patents, it's not just the 10 patents that could be a protective, defensive portfolio against others. It's everyone, all the members' patents. So just from that deterrent value of instead of 10, there's 1,000 patents now that protect not just me, but all the members. The deterrent effect is substantial that anyone trying to sue any of these members will know that it's not just them with the 10 patents or 0 patents that could be defensively used against them. It's the whole umbrella of the 1,000 patents. So this is innovative in the space. It's kind of counter to the whole point of building patents, but there is a purpose and use here. We're using the patents in a defensive way and actually putting the patents to protect the community and also preventing others who use patents for nefarious purposes from kind of filing patents in the space that should have otherwise been these companies' technology. So we're making patents actually work and be channeled into productive use for the Bitcoin community.
Right. And you mentioned the term patent pool.
Yes.
And when people hear that, they sometimes might think that, well, if you become a member of COPA, you have to make your patents available to every other member for their use. That's not what this is, right? This is purely a defensive alliance. And the idea is, as you say, number one, by joining, you make a pledge not to sue anybody else in the alliance, except defensively,
Yes.
obviously. So if you're sued, and the way you don't make your patents available for others' use, you make your patents available for others to use in a lawsuit defensively. So it's that very
get sued, and if it satisfies the criterion
right
that it is for defensive purposes, at that point they're able to make a request and use one of the patents from the pool. So you're exactly right about that.
Yeah. So as you say, we have a broad membership from the crypto community, companies in the space, as you say, including Coinbase, Kraken, Blockstream, Square, obviously, many others. We are definitely encouraging others who may not be natively from the crypto space, but maybe are crypto adjacent. So banks and money transmitters and fintech companies should also join, because to the extent they're going to be doing business in the crypto space, they're going to be subject to the same kind of trolls, and they should join as well.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point. There's kind of these two misconceptions that we try to address when we go to talk to potential members. One is, hey, I'm not even in the crypto business. I may be in the future. Why should I join? If that's the case, you're not putting any of your patents at stake here. And to the extent you grow into the crypto world, you have the protection. And two, there are crypto companies that say, I'm never going to file patents. I'm not going to have patents. So I don't have anything to offer to you. So why should I join as a member? No, you get the benefit, and there's strength in numbers, strength in everyone being together. More companies join.
As a company, don't feel like you have to have patents in order to join. You can join having no patents and with no intention of filing patents. And very important to me is to tell open source developers and projects out there that are not companies, merely people building, working on infrastructure, that they can join as well. And membership costs money, but there is a scale depending on your means. And if you're just a developer or an open source project, you can join for free, right?
Absolutely. I think the threshold is about, I might be wrong about this, about $10 million in annual revenue. At that point is when you even start having a membership fee, and even that's pretty nominal. It's on a scale of $5,000 to $20,000 per year. Most of the members we have we have a good range of members, but we have a number of small companies that don't have to pay a fee, but get the benefit. But by more and more members joining, you're accruing to the benefit of the whole problem we're trying to solve, which is to take all these patents at an early stage out of circulation from being potentially used nefariously against any of the members. So by doing that, we're protecting Bitcoin at large. Any company being sued is going to affect the whole Bitcoin community. Innovation is coming from all angles, and stifling any part of that, preventing any company from being able to offer its services through patents, is going to affect the entire community. So you're saying the right thing. Everyone and anyone should join. It's pretty minimal impact, especially if you don't have patents. And even if you have patents, it's the narrow tranche of crypto technology patents that are foundationally needed for the architecture and other building blocks for Bitcoin technology. And you also brought up a good point about open source developers. I feel like one of the foundational goals in even establishing COPA was to, in addition to everything else, also protect open source developers who are building the infrastructure and keeping Bitcoin alive in a way, in lots of ways. And we see that we've seen, especially this year and over the last 2 years, even the Bitcoin developers who don't actually put out a product being affected on many IP litigation issues. And we can segue into that in a minute about all the things that we're doing there. But I want to reinforce the notion that COPA as an organization was built with the foundational goal of protecting also our open source developers.
Right. So let's talk about that. We were talking about trolls, and trollish behavior doesn't just happen on the patent side, it can also happen on the copyright side. And recently COPA filed a lawsuit against Craig Wright, a man who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto, and has been claiming copyright over the Bitcoin white paper. Can you tell us more about the lawsuit and where things stand?
Absolutely. So earlier this year, Craig Wright sent demand letters to several organizations and open source developers indicating that he has full ownership rights over the Bitcoin white paper and that these companies needed to take it down. It's very much an intellectual property based tangent. And he also, in addition to these letters, mentioned in videos and other places that he also intends to use database rights and others to go after people even using the Bitcoin database, as he calls it. This is a problem because the white paper, the foundation of Bitcoin, is open source. It belongs to the community. It does not belong to a single person. And that was not Satoshi's intent from every historical aspect related to what Satoshi did. And two, it was also released with an open source license. So regardless of whether anyone has a copyright claim, it is published with an open source license. And to claim ownership rights over that is wrong. And three, you are going after open source developers who are keeping Bitcoin alive and building the infrastructure. And we felt that COPA was in the best place to come to the aid of open source developers and to the community at large to address this concern. To claim ownership rights, you need to establish that you are indeed the author of the paper. We have not seen any proof of that established over the last 7 years. And that is the foundation for the lawsuit. We've asked a UK High Court to declare that he is not entitled to copyright rights in the paper because he has not shown and has been unable to show so far that he has copyright rights based on having actually authored the paper. So the lawsuit is about the copyrights. It will bring into issue and into light whether there is any proof or evidence to him actually having authored and owned the paper at any point. So that is the lawsuit. We filed the lawsuit about 2 months ago. We intend, as is the ethos of Bitcoin, to keep this completely as possible.
As open as a lawsuit can be.
As open as a lawsuit can be. Follow our Twitter handle. It's we'll publish that, and we'll keep updates regularly published there. It's funny, we filed the lawsuit and overnight we had over 6,000 Twitter followers just from that. But the one thing I would mention to people is lawsuits in the US or the UK are very slow. There's a process to go through. It's going to be years before we see final resolution, but we're on the track to seek resolution here and establish that the white paper is indeed something that belongs to the community. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Obviously there's a lot of interest from the community in this lawsuit. And number one message that I would have for the community is when there's anything to report, we will definitely report it. It's just that, Kirupa, you're a you've been a litigator. You can attest to the fact that lawsuits sometimes just, there's a lot of action and then there's long periods of inaction or slow action, right? And so, folks should be patient with the UK legal system. And second, the community, I've seen lots of folks ask, what can we do to help? Is there a fund? Can we contribute? What can we do? So what's the answer to that?
Thanks for bringing that point up. COPA is a nonprofit organization entirely run at the moment, by contributions from companies for all the initiatives that we have going, including the lawsuit. This is not going to be the only lawsuit. We will be there to protect the community against other things that happen in the patents or trademarks or copyright space. There's even in the design patent space. So I would encourage folks to look into how they can continue to contribute to COPA and the various litigation efforts. We will publish more information on that in our Twitter page. And the message to take away is that, yes, we're open and willing to receive funds to help us continue all of these activities.
Yeah. So number one, join COPA if you're in a business or you're an open source developer. By the way, the website is opencrypto.org. And number two, follow COPA on Twitter. The handle is opencrypto.org altogether. And to the extent that you want to, you're not somebody who's going to join, but you want to contribute, stay tuned. There will be an opportunity to do that, and we'll certainly let you know. Is there anything else you want to say, Kirupa, before we wrap it up?
This is great. Thank you for covering so much information in such a short span of time. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and the rest of the board and helping crypto be more successful.
Yeah, this is super important because if we're talking about the Bitcoin ethos, there really is no room for intellectual property, period, in Bitcoin, right? This is all supposed to be open. So thank you for doing what you're doing too. And with that, we're done.